Judge recognizes a childhood friend in court, and what happens next will totally surprise you. Carla Race sat in her commanding judge's chair at the district courthouse, surrounded by the usual hum of voices that preceded the start of a trial. For her, this setting was as familiar as the weight of the black robe draped over her shoulders. A new case file was placed before her by the court officer, accompanied by a brief announcement. Next case, Edson Alves. The name struck Carla like a lightning bolt. For a moment her heart faltered, and the murmurs around her seemed to dissolve into silence. Edson Alves. It couldn't be true. A whirlwind of memories flooded her mind. The bright-eyed grin of a young boy, laughter echoing across the rolling hills of the small village where fate seemed to hum in every corner, and the stern reprimands of her father. Taking a deep breath, Carla tried to rein in the wave of emotions as she opened the file. The photo staring back at her from the criminal record was chillingly cold. Edson, older now, with features hardened by time, he was charged with theft and murder. When Edson was escorted into the courtroom, the carefully rehearsed words in Carla's mind unraveled. He was different. The vibrant youth she remembered had been replaced by a face lined with distrust and weariness. Yet something about him was unmistakable. This was Edson, the boy who had once shared her secrets and dreams of impossible futures. For an instant that felt like an eternity, their eyes met. Edson seemed to hesitate, and his gaze betrayed a flicker of recognition before quickly looking away, his expression hardening. Carla, in turn, fought to conceal the impact of that brief connection. In the crowded courtroom, any sign of emotion could be seen as a weakness. The prosecutor began the case with a straightforward, almost disinterested narrative. Edson had been caught on a convenience store's security cameras. The store clerk accused him of shoving him aside before grabbing money from the till. There were no additional witnesses or solid physical evidence, only a minor criminal history that was used to support the charges. As Carla listened to the prosecutor's presentation, a growing unease settled over her. The argument was shallow, and the evidence was weak, yet she had to remain impartial. Rising from her seat, she announced, "Defense, please." Joanna Silva, Edson's attorney, was young, but her confident demeanor radiated experience and determination. Her eyes shone with the resolve of someone prepared to fight tooth and nail. What we have here is a textbook example of how biases and sloppy investigations can lead to unjust trials, she began firmly. Carla leaned slightly forward in her chair, watching as Joanna started to dismantle the prosecution's case. The grainy security footage showed only a man in a blue hoodie, his back to the camera, committing the crime. Edson had been arrested because a local officer, familiar with his past, thought he fit the description. As Joanna meticulously pointed out the inconsistencies in the evidence, Carla felt the weight of her position grow heavier. The courtroom was no longer just a place of impartiality. It was a crossroads of past and present, justice and bias. And at its center stood two people whose lives were once intertwined in ways neither could fully escape. As Joanna spoke, Carla couldn't help but let her mind wander back to the past. She remembered young Edson, unfairly accused of stealing apples from the market. Back then, he had been thrown out of the store before he could even explain that he was only looking. Carla had done nothing to defend him. The trial moved forward, but for Carla, every word echoed the countless injustices that had piled up over a lifetime. Sitting in that chair, she felt crushed between her professional responsibilities and the emotional weight of confronting a fragment of her past that she had tried to bury for years. When the first day of the hearing came to a close, Edson was escorted out of the courtroom. Before disappearing through the door, he glanced back one last time, as if searching for something or someone. Carla saw that his look carried more than pain. It was a reflection of everything that years of silence had destroyed. Back in the quiet of her office, Carla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The comfortable chair, once a symbol of her authority, now felt like a throne of thorns. Edson Alves wasn't just a name in a court case. To Carla, he was a living reminder of what could have been and what she most feared confronting. There was no way to turn back time or reset the clock that marked the end of the day, but she knew the night ahead would be long. The past, like an unwelcome visitor, had returned, and she would have to face it, whether she wanted to or not. The silence in Carla's office was broken only by the soft ticking of an old wall clock. She tried to focus on other cases, but her mind kept drifting to a time she thought she had left behind. It was a hot summer afternoon in the small village of Campo Sereno, where Carla had grown up. The air was thick with dust and heat, and children's laughter echoed through fields of sunflowers. A girl with her hair tied in two braids ran after a wayward kite. The kite crashed into an old fence, and before Carla could reach it, a skinny boy with a mischievous smile and bright, sparkling eyes appeared to help her. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding up the kite like a trophy. Yeah, but I could have gotten it myself," Carla replied, pretending to be indignant, though she was clearly relieved. "Maybe, but not as fast as me. I'm Edson." That was the beginning. In the months that followed, they became inseparable, sharing secrets, laughter, and small adventures far from the judgmental eyes of the village. Carla knew even then that there was something forbidden about their friendship. She was the daughter of a respected shopkeeper, living a comfortable life in a big house. Edson came from a family that could barely scrape by, living in a marginalized part of town. Despite this, they found refuge in each other. Edson was fearless, creative, and always had a solution for life's little problems. When Carla's father forced her to spend hours studying, it was Edson who would call her to play by the nearby stream. When he became the target of disapproving looks or cruel comments at the market, Carla defended him with a fierceness that seemed far bigger than her 10 years. But there were moments when the gap between their worlds was impossible to ignore. Once, while they were playing in front of the church, an older woman passed by and cast them a disapproving look. "You should know better than to keep company like that, young lady," the woman said sharply. Carla had stayed silent in that moment, but the words lingered in her mind. Even so, it wasn't enough to tear them apart back then. Edson remained the companion who lightened Carla's days, and she was the only one who saw him as more than his circumstances. Now, years later, as she reviewed the case, Carla realized that the distance between their worlds had never truly disappeared. Carla had never told Edson, but that memory stayed with her forever. Even if she hadn't fully understood at the time, she knew the town viewed their friendship as something wrong. Everything changed one afternoon, shortly before Carla's 12th birthday. The two of them were sitting under the shade of a large tree, sharing slices of a mango Edson had gotten from a nearby orchard. Carla remembered the sound of firm footsteps even before she saw him, her father, striding toward them with long steps and a face red with anger. "What are you doing here with him?" her father demanded, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Dad, he's just my friend, Edson," Carla replied, her heart racing. "Friend? You have no business spending time with people like him." "Now go home," Carla tried to protest, but her father's stern glare left no room for argument. Edson, who was usually so fearless, just lowered his head and stayed quiet. That silence hurt more than any words could have. When he finally looked up at Carla, his eyes carried a sadness she would never forget. That exchange broke her heart. That night, Carla overheard her parents talking. "She has a future ahead of her," her father said. "She can't be mixing with people like him." It was the last time Carla saw Edson for a long time. Not long after, she learned that he and his family had moved away. The weight of that day followed her for the rest of her life. As she grew up, Carla threw herself into her studies, determined to excel in everything she did. Becoming a judge was more than a professional achievement for her. It was her way of seeking justice in a world that always seemed unjust to people like Edson. Back in the present, sitting in her office, Carla felt the weight of guilt. She had obeyed her father, breaking a bond that had meant so much to her. And Edson, he had been swept away by a current he never chose. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the court officer bringing more documents for the case. Carla thanked him with a quick nod, but her mind remained trapped in the past. Later, alone in her apartment, Carla opened a forgotten drawer. Inside, she found a faded photograph. Two children smiled together under the shade of a tree, her eyes filled with tears. That boy was now a man, unfairly accused, and she knew in some way she had contributed to it by walking away. Carla closed the drawer firmly. Whatever had happened in the past, she couldn't let its shadows interfere with what she had to do now. In the courtroom, the room was packed with curious journalists and even some community members who seemed to have already formed their opinions about Edson Alves's case. The cold lights illuminated Carla's face as she adjusted her glasses and prepared for the session to begin. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman, opened the case with a straightforward but emotionless narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant, Edson Alves, was identified as the perpetrator of a robbery at a downtown convenience store. He was captured on security cameras and recognized by the clerk who was assaulted during the incident. The prosecution will prove that Mr. Alves, with a history of aggression, is guilty of this crime. Edson, seated beside his lawyer, kept his expression neutral. Only those paying close attention would notice the tight grip of his hands, a telltale sign of the tension he was trying to conceal. The prosecutor called the first witness, the store clerk, a young man with a weary face, who climbed onto the witness stand. Carla noted the nervousness in his posture. "Can you confirm if the man here today is the same person who robbed the store?" the prosecutor asked. The clerk hesitated before answering. "Well, he looked like the man in the video." "Looks like?" the prosecutor pressed, trying to clarify. "He is the man, isn't he?" The clerk faltered again, clearly unsure. Carla jotted something down in her notebook. The witness's uncertainty was already a weak point for the prosecution. Next, a security video was shown. The shaky, low-quality footage played on the screen, showing a man, back turned to the camera, wearing a blue hoodie. His features were indistinct. He appeared to take something from the register as the clerk cowered. The defense attorney, Joanna Silva, immediately stood after the video ended. "Your Honor, I'd like to highlight that the video does not provide a clear identification of the defendant. There is no physical evidence linking Mr. Alves to the crime, beyond assumptions based on this low-quality footage." The prosecutor shot Joanna a sharp look but did not respond. She knew the point was valid. The next to testify was the police officer who had arrested Edson. He described the moment he found Edson wearing a blue hoodie, like the one the clerk had described. However, the officer admitted that he had not found the stolen item or any other concrete evidence at the scene. "Officer, did you have any evidence besides the hoodie to justify the arrest?" Joanna asked during cross-examination. "Well, the suspect's history," the officer began. "I'm not interested in his history. I'm asking about concrete evidence," Joanna interjected. The officer hesitated. "No, ma'am." Carla watched everything closely. It was evident that the case against Edson had more gaps than solid proof. Yet the courtroom seemed predisposed to convict him. The room was filled with implicit judgments, based more on Edson's appearance and past than the evidence presented. As the prosecution proceeded, its arguments relied more on circumstantial evidence than definitive facts. Carla couldn't stop thoughts of Edson's past from creeping in as she observed the trial. Even back in school, he had always been the first to be blamed for any trouble, often without proof. It was a constant pattern, something that seemed to follow him throughout his life. As the afternoon wore on, the prosecutor, sensing the fragility of her argument, began to dredge up Edson's past. Minor infractions, small thefts, and defiance of authority. These incidents had happened years ago, and Carla knew that stories like this could be enough to sway the jury against him, even if they had no real connection to the current case. When the day's proceedings finally concluded, Carla remained seated in the empty courtroom, her thoughts heavy. She reflected on how the system seemed designed to trap people like Edson. Mistakes from the past turned into chains that held them down. making true rehabilitation or justice feel almost impossible. Later that night, back in her apartment, Carla gazed out at the city lights through her window. The weight of the situation pressed on her. The trial had only just begun, but one thing was clear. Edson Alves wasn't just fighting the charges against him. He was battling a system that had seemingly condemned him long before he ever stepped into the courtroom. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as Edson was called to the stand. The room, now utterly silent, felt charged with expectation. Many in the audience, and even some of the jurors, seemed to have already made up their minds. After all, Edson was no stranger to the judicial system, but what would he say? And more importantly, could his words be enough to shift the tide of this trial? He walked to the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps. Dressed in a plain, neatly pressed shirt, he exuded a quiet dignity. Sitting down, he squared his shoulders and looked toward his defense attorney, Joanna Silva, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. "Please state your name for the court," Joanna began, her voice calm but steady. "My name is Edson Alves. I'm 33 years old, a construction worker, and I live in Jardim das Flores," he replied, his tone firm. There was a brief pause, allowing his words to settle in the room. "You are being accused of assault and murder during a robbery at a convenience store. How do you plead?" Joanna asked directly. "Innocent," Edson responded, his voice unwavering. Joanna began crafting her defense with precision, focusing on Edson's story. "You've had prior run-ins with the law, haven't you?" she asked, addressing the elephant in the room. Edson took a deep breath. Carla noticed his hands tighten ever so slightly, a sign of the tension beneath his calm exterior. "Yes, I've made mistakes. When I was younger, I stole small things. I got into fights, but that was years ago. Since then, I've worked hard to turn my life around." The murmur rippled through the audience. Carla observed closely, feeling both admiration for Edson's courage and sadness for how much he needed to justify himself. Yet, here he was, standing firm against the allegations. "What happened on the night of the crime?" Joanna asked, moving to the heart of the matter. "I was heading home after a day at the construction site," Edson began. "I stopped by a friend's bar to pick up some tools I'd left there. We talked for a few minutes and then I left. By the time I got home, the police were already waiting for me." "Why didn't your friend testify on your behalf?" Joanna pressed. Edson hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "Because he's scared. He's had run-ins with the police before. If he gets involved, he could get into trouble. I didn't want to drag him into this." His honesty filled the room, and Carla could see its effect on the jurors. It was hard not to feel empathy for someone who openly admitted his past missteps, but vehemently denied the crime he was accused of now. Joanna leaned in, her voice softer but deliberate as she asked the question that hung heavily in the room. "Edson, do you feel like you're being judged for your past and not for what happened in this case?" He let out a long sigh, his gaze drifting to the jury before briefly meeting Carla's eyes, as if his answer was meant for her as well. "Yes, I do. I've always felt that way. Ever since I was a kid, I was always the first one blamed, even when I hadn't done anything. It's easy to point the finger at someone like me. I come from a poor family. I grew up in a neighborhood where nobody gets a fair shot. I've made mistakes, but I've paid for them, and now here I am again fighting, not just against these accusations, but against everything people already decided about me before they even heard my side." The room was silent, his words resonating like a plea for understanding. Carla's chest tightened, his voice, his story. It was a mirror reflecting not just his struggles, but the systemic failures that had followed him his whole life. For a moment, the courtroom wasn't just a battleground for justice, it was a stage for a man fighting to reclaim his humanity. The courtroom was engulfed in silence. Carla felt a lump rise in her throat as Edson's words echoed through the space. They carried a weight she had always known existed, but had never confronted so directly. The prosecutor, quick to seize the moment, tried to dismantle Edson's testimony during cross-examination, hammering on his past and implying he had every reason to lie. Yet Edson stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "I can't change who I used to be," he said. his eyes steady and unflinching under the prosecutor's scrutiny. "But I can show you who I am now." When Edson left the witness stand, the atmosphere shifted. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a person. Flawed, yes, but also undeniably human, brimming with dignity. As Carla settled back into her judge's chair, she realized something inside her had shifted too. Edson's words hadn't just added a new layer to the case. They had reshaped how she saw him, the system, and perhaps even herself. As the court recessed for a short break, Carla allowed herself a glance at Edson. He didn't return it, but she knew he felt her understanding. For the first time, the battle didn't seem like his alone. When the session resumed, the defense attorney, Joanna Silva, rose to her feet. She smoothed the front of her suit with quiet confidence and stood with an air of determination that hinted the tide was about to turn. The evidence that had placed Edson in the defendant's chair was about to face scrutiny like never before. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Joanna began, her voice laced with both passion and resolve, "it's time to uncover the truth behind these accusations." She walked purposefully toward the screen where the prosecution had played the convenience store's security footage, their supposed smoking gun. "This video," she said, gesturing toward it, "has been presented as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, a video used to link my client to this crime. But let's take another look, this time with fresh eyes." The footage rolled again. The grainy video showed a figure in a blue hoodie, their face blurred beyond recognition. Joanna pointed to the screen. "Notice the person in the video, dressed generically, their face completely indistinguishable. The quality of this footage is so poor, it makes any reliable identification impossible." She paused, letting her words sink in, then added, "Your Honor, the defense consulted a digital imaging expert who reviewed this footage and determined it is inconclusive for identification purposes." The expert was called to the stand. Speaking in straightforward terms, he explained that the video's resolution was insufficient to definitively identify anyone. When Joanna asked the key question, whether it was possible to confirm the person in the footage was Edson Alves, the expert's response was clear and firm. "No, there is no way to definitively identify him from this video," he stated. The prosecutor tried to push back, but the damage was done. The jury's doubt was growing, and Joanna wasn't finished. She turned her attention to an even bolder move, calling the arresting officer to the stand. The tension in the room crackled as the officer took his place. He was a commanding presence, the kind of figure who didn't like being questioned. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight of what was coming next. Joanna approached him with measured steps, her voice calm but cutting. "Officer, you were the one who arrested Mr. Alves, correct?" "Yes," he replied, his tone clipped. "And when you detained him, was there any physical evidence tying him to the crime? The stolen item, perhaps?" The officer hesitated, the pause stretching uncomfortably before he answered, "No." Joanna's gaze didn't waver. "No evidence. So the arrest was based solely on the fact that he was wearing a blue hoodie, similar to the one seen in this indistinct video." "That's correct," the officer admitted reluctantly. "Let me clarify for the jury," Joanna said, turning to face them directly. "My client was arrested because of a piece of clothing, a hoodie. No fingerprints, no stolen items recovered, no other concrete evidence. Just a hoodie and a hunch." The murmurs in the courtroom were impossible to ignore. Even Carla, from her elevated seat, could sense the foundation of the prosecution's case crumbling. Joanna wasn't just dismantling the evidence. She was revealing the fragility of the system that had put Edson in this position. And as the officer shifted uncomfortably on the stand, it was clear she wasn't afraid to expose the cracks. The courtroom wasn't just a battleground for guilt or innocence anymore. It had become a stage for something deeper, for a fight against bias, assumptions, and a system that too often failed people like Edson Alves. The officer mentioned earlier that the arrest was based on a description provided by the victim and the security footage, Joanna said, her voice steady but probing. "Let me ask you, officer, during the arrest, did you find the blue hoodie that was supposedly connected to the crime? The officer hesitated before responding, his words measured. No, we didn't find the hoodie, nor any other physical evidence. No stolen money, no fingerprints. Joanna leaned in slightly, her tone sharpening as she pressed on. So, to be clear, the arrest was made based solely on a vague description and Edson Alves's prior record. The officer shifted in his seat, visibly uneasy. He didn't deny it, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any admission. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as jurors exchanged uncertain glances. The foundation of the prosecution's case was beginning to crack. Next, Joanna turned her attention to the store clerk, whose earlier testimony had been riddled with inconsistencies. She approached him with a calm, almost disarming demeanor. You previously testified that you identified Mr. Alves as the suspect. Could you tell us why you were so sure? The clerk hesitated, fidgeting nervously before answering. I thought it was him because the officer told me it was him, he admitted reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. From her seat on the bench, Carla felt a surge of indignation. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on her. It was becoming painfully clear that the case against Edson wasn't built on solid evidence, but rather on a shaky mix of assumptions and bias. But the most damning moment came when Joanna shifted her focus to the prosecutor, her gaze piercing as she posed the question. Why wasn't the video evidence analyzed more thoroughly before this trial began? The prosecutor, caught off guard, responded defensively. The investigation was conducted urgently to ensure the suspect was apprehended quickly. Urgency, Joanna repeated, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Or recklessness. She let the question hang in the air, daring the prosecutor to defend an investigation that was unraveling before everyone's eyes. As Joanna continued to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, Carla couldn't help but feel the weight of judgment shift within the room. It was as though the courtroom itself had become a reflection of a larger reckoning, not just of Edson Alves's innocence or guilt, but of the flaws in a system that seemed too eager to label and convict. For a moment, Carla felt as if she too were being judged, not as a judge, but as part of a system that had long failed people like Edson. And yet, as the defense's case grew stronger, so did a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. As a judge, Carla knew her duty was to remain impartial, but she couldn't ignore the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She thought about how many people like Edson had been dragged into courtrooms, their lives dissected and judged, often without anyone questioning the lack of evidence. The very system she had pledged to uphold seemed to fail the vulnerable, perpetuating cycles of injustice instead of breaking them. By the end of the day, as court adjourned for a recess, Carla felt the weight of what was unfolding before her. This wasn't just another criminal trial. It was a battle against a system built on prejudice and flawed norms. When the jury filed back into the room, the air was thick with tension. Carla sat at her bench, trying to project the calm expected of her, though her heart pounded in her chest. Edson Alves sat beside his attorney, Joanna Silva, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His face betrayed no emotion, but his clenched fists told another story, the unbearable weight of waiting. The clerk stood, asking everyone to rise as the verdict was handed to the foreperson. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours until the foreperson finally spoke. In the case of the state versus Edson Alves, regarding the charges of assault and homicide, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. A collective sigh swept through the courtroom. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, disappointed by the outcome, while others quietly celebrated. Joanna placed a hand on Edson's shoulder, a gesture of relief. Edson closed his eyes for a moment, his tense shoulders relaxing slightly, but there was no joy in his expression, only a deep exhaustion. This victory, hard won as it was, did nothing to erase the years of injustice he'd endured. Carla struck her gavel, signaling the end of the trial. She thanked the jury for their service and watched as the courtroom began to empty. From her bench, she saw Edson surrounded by Joanna and a few supporters. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange of something neither time nor circumstance could erase, a shared belief in the possibility of justice. "Justice was served, Your Honor," Joanna said, her tone edged with bitterness as she passed Carla. Carla swallowed hard and didn't answer immediately. "Edson, you've been acquitted. That's what matters now," she finally said. Edson lowered his head, his voice low but heavy with emotion. "You don't understand, Carla. I didn't win today. I just didn't lose again. But you had the chance to do more than just follow these damn rules." His words struck her like a blow, the truth of them pressing down on her chest. He was right. She hadn't done enough. "I failed you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't make excuses. I know words don't mean much, but I want you to know I'll do everything I can to make things better. I can't change the past, but I can try to stop this from happening to someone else." Edson looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "I hope you do, because people can't keep waiting for the system to finally work." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom. Carla stayed behind, watching his retreating figure. She could see the weight he carried, the invisible scars left by a life marked by inequality and prejudice. Back in her office, Carla sank into her chair. For the first time, her judicial robe felt unbearably heavy, almost suffocating. She glanced at the stacks of files on her desk, feeling a shift within herself. The system she had sworn to uphold wasn't just imperfect, it was fundamentally broken. And for too long, she had been complicit in its failures. But this didn't have to be the end. That evening, as Carla stood by the window of her apartment, gazing out at the sprawling city, a quiet determination took root in her heart. It wasn't enough to simply enforce the law anymore. She needed to question it, challenge it, and when necessary, push to change it. Edson Alves was free, but his battle was far from over. And now Carla understood that his fight was hers too. The world wouldn't change overnight, she knew that, but she could start somewhere, not just as a judge, but as someone who grasped that real justice went beyond the written rules. True justice was about understanding people, hearing their stories, and fighting to give everyone a genuine chance to live unshackled by invisible chains. For the first time in what felt like years, Carla felt ready for what lay ahead. She would no longer turn away from the responsibility of making a difference. And as the city lights shimmered against the night sky, Carla knew one thing for certain: the journey toward justice had only just begun. Did you enjoy today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.